Dana describes Butler as entering the general's presence with a flushed face and a haughty air, holding out the order relieving him from command in the field and asking, "General Grant, did you issue this order?" To which Grant, in a hesitating manner, replied, "No, not in that form." Dana, perceiving at this point that the subject under discussion was likely to be unpleasant, if not stormy, at once took his leave, but the impression made upon his mind by what he saw while present was that Butler had in some measure cowed his commanding officer. What further took place neither he nor Mr. Dana has ever said. Butler's book, however, contains what purports to be a full account of the interview, but it is to be observed that it signally fails to recite any circumstance of an overbearing nature. Not only was the order promptly revoked by Special Orders No. 62, July 19th, but Butler's command on the field was extended to include the newly arrived 19th Corps, and this disposition of command was still in force when Butler butted in to the Fort Fisher expedition, taking his powder boat with him, regardless of Delafield's discussion of the value of powder boats. The boat was towed into position by Commander Rind of the Navy, who reported placing it within 300 yards of the northeast salient of Fort Fisher, which bore west-southwest a half west about midnight of Dex 23, 1864. It was fired by several lines of Gomez fuse running through the mass of powder and ignited by several devices arranged to act an hour and a half after the ship was deserted. The explosion occurred at 2 a.m. and was supposed by the garrison of the fort to be the accidental explosion of a Federal gunboat. Not the slightest damage was done to the fort, whose garrison remained in ignorance of Butler's plans until published afterward. On the 24th and 25th, the fort was subjected to a terrific bombardment at the rate of 40 to 50 shells per minute for hours at a time, until the fleet had practically exhausted its ammunition. It had not silenced the fort nor materially damaged it, which, being reported by the land forces who had been put ashore, they re-embarked without assaulting on the night of the 26th, and the next day the expedition returned to Fortress Monroe. The casualties in the fort from the fire of the ships were 61, and a greater number were suffered in the fleet from the 662 shots fired by the fort. Another and a still larger expedition was soon gotten together and dispatched against Fort Fisher, but though his own campaign was still in abeyance, the political situation was now so improved by the successes elsewhere that Grant was no longer afraid to exercise his authority, and on Jan 4 he wrote to Halleck demanding Butler's official head. With a celerity indicative of the pleasure with which both Halleck and Lincoln complied with the request, it was presented to him. On Jan 7, in General Orders No. 1, by direction of the President, Major General Butler was relieved from command and ordered to repair to Lowell, Mass. On Jan 5, a new expedition, under the command of Porter and Jenners Terry, set sail, carrying about 9,500 infantry and a heavy siege train. It arrived before Fort Fisher and opened fire on Jan 13, in even greater force than on the previous occasion. A land force of about 7,000 infantry was at hand for its defence. Mr. Davis sent Bragg to command it, who made no effort to prevent the enemy's landing. It might have been difficult to prevent him, but to make no effort brought complaint and discouragement. The bombardment was, on this occasion, kept up without intermission day or night, and, instead of being general, was concentrated upon the land defences. On the afternoon of the second day, the palisades and guns of those defences being destroyed and a breach opened, 2 assaults were made about 3 p.m., one by Ames's division of the 23rd Corps, about 4,500 strong, and one by 2,000 sailors and marines from the fleet under Captains Breeze. The latter assaulted the breach, but were repulsed with severe loss. The infantry, passing around and through the palisades, made a lodgment between the traverses, and after 7 hours' fighting possessed the fort. When Bragg took command of the land forces, Whiting, who had commanded the whole post before, took command of the fort. He was mortally and Colin Lamb desperately wounded in the defence. The loss of the infantry assaulting column was 110 killed, 536 wounded. During the winter, the Confederate lines about Petersburg had been constantly extended at both ends. It has been already explained how. The troops were extended with them until it was about 37 miles by the shortest routes from our extreme left on White Oak Swamp below Richmond on the north side to our extreme right below Petersburg. Lee's force at this time was about 50,000 and Grant's about 124,000. Humphreys gives the following brief statement of the Confederate condition. The winter of 64 and 65 was one of unusual severity, making the picket duty in front of the entrenchments very severe. It was especially so to the Confederate troops with their threadbare, insufficient clothing and meagre food. Meat they had but little of, and their subsistence department was actually importing it from abroad. Of coffee or tea or sugar, they had none except in the hospitals. It is stated that in a secret session of the Confederate Congress the condition of the Confederacy as to subsistence was declared to be that there was not meat enough in the Southern Confederacy for the armies it had in the field, that there was not in Var either meat or bread enough for the armies within her limits, that the supply of bread for those armies to be obtained from other places depended absolutely upon keeping open the railroad connections of the South, that the meat must be obtained from abroad through a seaport, that the transportation was not now adequate from whatever cause to meet the necessary demands of the service. The condition of the deserters who constantly came into our lines during the winter appeared to prove that there was no exaggeration in this statement. In addition to the scarcity of provisions, there was also threatened a deficiency of percussion caps. The supply for the campaign of 1864 had been maintained only by cutting up the copper stills of the country, but they were now exhausted, and there was no more copper in sight. Colorn Taylor, in 4 years with Lee, writes that during the last 30 days before Petersburg, the loss to the army by desertion averaged 100 men a day. The condition of affairs throughout the South at that period was truly deplorable. Hundreds of letters addressed to soldiers were intercepted and sent to army headquarters, in which mothers, wives, and sisters told of their inability to respond to the appeals of hungry children for bread, or to provide proper care and remedies for the sick, and in the name of all that was dear appealed to the men to come home and rescue them from the ills which they suffered and the starvation which threatened them. Surely never was devotion to one's country and to one's duty more sorely tested than was the case with the soldiers of Lee's army during the last year of the war. Early in February there occurred the last of the many affairs on our right flank. Grant had found that we were still hauling supplies from the Weldon RR, and had sent Gregg's cavalry to destroy it and tear it up for 40 miles south, and the 2D and 5th Corps were sent across Hatcher's Run to guard their rear. Lee, hearing of the Federals outside of their entrenchments, sent 3 divisions under Mahone, Evans, and Pegram to attack them. There was sharp fighting for 2 days without material success on either side. The Federal losses were 14 to 74, and probably the Confederate were 1,000. Among them, unfortunately, was General Pegram, whose loss was universally deplored. Collier Taylor, under date of December 4, has noted the loss of another brilliant and popular young officer who had been a classmate of Pegram's at West Point in 1854, as follows. General Gracie, who showed such tact in getting General Lee to descend from a dangerous position, was killed near the lines a day or so ago. He was an excellent officer, had passed through many hard-fought battles, escaped numberless dangers, and was finally killed while quietly viewing the enemy from a point where no one dreamed of danger. Colon Taylor, in a letter, describes the incident referred to as follows. General Lee was making an inspection along the line occupied by General Gracie's troops. The fire of the enemy's sharpshooters was uncomfortably accurate along there, and the orders were against needless exposure. To get a good view, General Lee mounted the parapet or stepped out in front of the works. Of course, all who saw it realized his danger, but who was to direct his attention to it? General Gracie at once stepped to his side. The Minis whistled viciously. General Lee, oblivious to his own danger, quickly realized General Gracie's and immediately removed from the point of danger. That is all, but it showed tact on the part of the latter. I have already said that the fall of 1864 was the period of the war when the Confederate authorities might have made peace with greatest advantage to their people. Had they then offered a return to the Union, they might have secured liberal compensation for their slaves, and generally more liberal terms financially and politically than at any other period of the contest. What these concessions might have been was suggested in the conference held at Fortress Monroe on January 30, between Messrs. Lincoln and Seward, and the commissioners sent by Mr. Davis, Messrs. Stevens, Hunter, and Campbell. After this conference adjourned without coming to any agreement, there were rumors that Mr. Lincoln had offered to pay the South $400,000 in bonds as compensation for the slaves, if the South would return to the Union. This was denied by some of Mr. Davis's cabinet, and the discussion brought out informal statements which Mr. Lincoln had made in the conversation which had taken place. One was, "Take a sheet of paper and let me write at the top Union, and you may fill in the rest to suit yourselves." To this, Mr. Stevens had to reply that the power to write that word was the single power which had been denied the commission. Next, Mr. Lincoln said that he had always felt that slavery having had the sanction of the government as a whole, it was unfair that the whole financial loss of its abolition should be thrown upon the South, that he had always felt ready to vote bonds to compensate her for this loss, and that he had heard as much as $400,000 suggested for this purpose. There was no formal proposition made, for the conference never reached that stage, but it is well known that until the day of his death, Mr. Lincoln cherished a desire to see the South compensated for the loss of her slaves, and that on February 5, immediately after the failure of the Fortress Monroe Conference, he submitted to his cabinet a proposition to offer the South $400,000 in 6% bonds in payment for peace with the abolition of slavery. His cabinet unanimously disapproved it, to his surprise and chagrin, whereon he dropped the matter, saying sadly, "You are all opposed to me." Few cabinet secrets were better kept than this, Nicolay says, but the diary of Sec. Wells refers to it as follows. The President had matured a scheme which he hoped would be useful in promoting peace. It was a proposition for paying the expense of the war for 200 days, or $400,000, to the rebel states to be for the extinguishment of slavery, or for such purpose as the states were disposed. This in a few words was the scheme. It did not meet with favour, but was dropped. Early in March, Sherman's army moved into N.C., where it was confronted by General Joseph E. Johnston, recalled by the Confederate Congress to command the army composed of the garrisons of Savannah and Charleston, and the remnants of the army of Hood which had been brought over from Tupelo, Miss. It was plain that Lee would soon be forced to abandon Richmond and Petersburg, and take advantage of his interior lines to unite with Johnston, and endeavour to crush Sherman before he could unite with Grant. Before undertaking this, which was felt to be an almost impossible task, however, he determined upon one last effort to break up Grant in his immediate front, in spite of all of his fortifications. He selected for his point of attack Fort Stedman, about a mile from the Appomattox River on Grant's right, and assigned Gordon to command the assault which was to be made Mares 25. A surprise was relied on to secure Fort Stedman. 3 columns of 100 men each, with local guides, were to seize what Gordon took to be 3 redoubts commanding Stedman on each side. A division was to follow them, and through the gap thus made, the lines were to be swept in both directions, and a force of cavalry was to ride and destroy the pontoon bridges across the Appomattox, and to raid City Point. Taking advantage of an order allowing deserters to come in with their arms, several pickets were captured, the trench guard rushed, the frays and abatis cut quickly by a strong pioneer party, and Fort Stedman was assaulted and occupied with 2 adjacent batteries. But the 3 redoubts were found to be only some old open lines at commanding points now unoccupied. Federal infantry presently came in force and killed or captured all of the 3 columns sent under a misapprehension very likely to occur where earthworks have to be guessed at from imperfect observation. Field's division, which had been ordered over by rail from the north side, was delayed by the breaking down of the train. The column which had taken Fort Stedman was caught like rats in a trap. Humphreys writes, "The crossfire of artillery and infantry on the space between the lines prevented the enemy from escaping and reinforcements from coming to them. Many were killed and wounded trying to get back to their own lines. 1949 prisoners, including 71 officers and 9 stand of colours, fell into Gentry Park's hands. His loss was 494 killed and wounded and 523 missing, a total of 1017. While this fighting was going on, the other Federal Corps were ordered to feel the lines in their fronts, it being hoped they might find some weak spots from which men had been drawn for Gordon's attack. Much sharp fighting resulted at many points, the total casualties for the day reaching 2,000 for the Federals and 4,000 for the Confederates. These attacks, however, everywhere failed entirely of their purpose, except at a single point on the lines of the 6th Corps, about 9 miles to our right from the point of Gordon's attack. Here, opposite a fort called Fort Fisher, our abatis had been weakened to get in firewood from the front, and here the enemy were able to make a lodgment within our entrenched picket line. When Grant's general assault was made at 4 a.m. April 2nd, this was the spot, and the only one, where at first it was successful. Humphreys states that it was through openings made by the enemy for his convenience of access to the front. General Wright told me that this was the weakest part of all the line he saw, and the only point where it could have been carried. His loss in killed and wounded was 1,100, all of which occurred in the space of 15 minutes. Apprehensive now that Lee might abandon Petersburg and Richmond at any moment, Grant determined to delay no longer, taking the initiative in moving around his right flank. His effective force, by his latest returns, was 101,000 infantry, 9,000 artillery, 40,700 cavalry, total 124,700, with 369 guns. Lee's forces by his latest return, February 28, were 46,000 infantry, 5,000 artillery, and 6,000 cavalry, total 57,000, from which 3,000 should be deducted for desertions in March. In NC, Sherman was about Goldsboro with about 100,000, against which Johnston in front of Greensboro had perhaps 25,000. There was really no need that Grant should have hurried himself, for though by all the maxims of strategy Lee should now unite with Johnston and both attack Sherman, his deficiencies in transportation were so great that no such movement was practicable. On March 27th, Sheridan, with 2 divisions of his excellent cavalry with their magazine carbines, had rejoined the army, and Grant began to transfer his forces to his extreme left. A single division only, Devon's of the 24th Corps, was left north of the James. 2 divisions of the 25th Corps under Weitzel held the Bermuda Hundreds lines. All the rest of the infantry, about 90,000 muskets and the whole of the cavalry, thoroughly organised and abundantly equipped with transportation for rapid motion, on March 28th only awaited Grant's word to launch themselves upon Lee's communications. On this occasion Grant narrowly avoided one mistake of previous campaigns made, not only by himself in May 1864, but by Hooker in May 1863 and by Lee in June 1863. He kept his cavalry moving and acting with his infantry instead of sending it off on a raid, having suspended on the 29th orders of the previous day to move against the railroads. It is noticeable, too, that Grant, on this occasion, concentrated practically his entire force in the attack upon our right, whereas in the fall he had never attacked upon one flank without some demonstration, at least upon the other. On the 30th, Wilcox's division on the north and Hoth's on the south of Hatcher's Run had sharp affairs with the approaching Federals, whom they went out to meet in some cases, but were finally driven back within their lines. The Federal losses for the day were 1780. There are no returns for ours. Meanwhile, Lee was bringing up Pickett's and Johnson's divisions of infantry, about 6,600 men, and two of Lee's divisions of cavalry, about 57-60 men, for an expedition against Sheridan. They attacked him on the 31st, and drove him back in much confusion nearly to Dinwiddie CH. Night ended the fighting, with Pickett so far in advance that he would have been cut off by Warren's corps during the night had he waited until morning. But he fell back and took position in the morning at 5 Forks, 4 miles from our right at Burgess Mills. Here he made the fatal mistake of halting and proceeding to entrench, as well as the time and the scarcity of entrenching tools would permit. He was 4 miles away from where other troops could help him or they could be helped by him. He should never have stopped until he had connected with our right flank. Longstreet writes, "The position was not of Pickett's choosing but of his orders, and from his orders he assumed that he would be reinforced." As it was in the morning, April 1st, Sheridan, reinforced now by the 5th Corps, some 15,000 men, followed, and massing a force of cavalry on Pickett's right, with the 5th Corps he turned his left flank and routed him, capturing, as stated by Warren, 32 and 44 men, 11 colours and 4 guns, with a loss of only 634 men. The Federal General Winthrop was killed, and on the Confederate side Colanter Pegram, a brother of the Gentry Pegram, killed February 6, and highly distinguished as an artillerist. This battle was fought between 4 and 6 in the afternoon, and Humphreys notices a peculiar phenomenon of acoustic shadows, such as has been spoken of before in telling of other battles. He writes, "A singular circumstance connected with this battle is the fact that General Pickett was, all of this time and until near the close of the action, on the north side of Hatcher's Run, where he had heard no sound of the engagement, nor had he received any information concerning it. The distance was but little over a mile, and Fitz-Lee and Pickett were in company. Neither were on the field until the action was decided. Although this action was a complete success, after it was over, Warren was removed from the command of the 5th Corps by Sheridan, under charges of which Warren was afterward fully acquitted by a court of inquiry. When Grant heard at 9 p.m. of Sheridan's success, he was assured that he must now have Lee's long lines stretched to near the breaking strain, and that the time had come when he could renew his assaults, suspended since the occasion of the mine. With his usual promptness, he ordered the 2nd Corps, which was near him, south of Hatcher's Run, to feel our works in its front at once. The other corps, stretching back to Petersburg, were ordered to cannonade our lines during the night, and, at his favourite hour of 4 a.m., to assault all the soft spots, of which, for 2 or 3 days, each corps commander had been ordered to make a study. The midnight demonstration by the 2d Corps waked a heavy fire of musketry and artillery, but produced no other results. The assault of the 6th Corps at dawn, however, under Wright, was made at the point where our abattis had been weakened, and the enemy had made a lodgment, en masse. 25. As before mentioned, here their assault was entirely successful, after incurring a loss of 1,100 men. They then turned to the left and swept the Confederate line to its extremity. At the crossing of the Jerusalem Plank Road, Parke got possession of an advanced line, with 12 guns and 800 prisoners, but he failed to carry our main line in the rear, and the fighting was kept up all day. At all other points the morning assaults were repulsed. After capturing all the works to the south and west, the enemy now turned toward Petersburg, where 2 isolated works, Forts Gregg and Whitworth, about 300 yards apart, stood about 1,000 yards in front of our main line of entrenchments. The rear of Fort Gregg was closed with a palisade, and its ditch was generally impassable. On the right flank, however, a line to connect with Whitworth had been started, and here the unfinished ditch and parapet gave a narrow access to the parapet of Gregg. It was by this route that the enemy finally reached it. It was defended by 2 guns of the Washington Artillery under Lieutenant McElroy and Lieutenant Colin Duncan, with the 12th and 16th Miss, 214 men in all. Fort Whitworth was open at the gorge, and was held by 3 guns of the Washington Artillery and the 19th and 48th Miss. until the final charge was being made upon Fort Gregg, when, by Lee's order, the garrison was withdrawn. The defence of Fort Gregg was notable, as was also the attack. The Federal forces were evidently feeling the inspiration of success, and the Confederates the desperation of defeat. Several attacks by Foster's division of the 24th Corps were repulsed. The last, aided by 2 brigades of Turner's division, while the 3D Brigade advanced upon Whitworth, swarmed over the parapet of Gregg and captured inside the 2 guns with 2 colours. Of the garrison, 55 were killed, 129 were wounded, and only 30 were found uninjured of the 214. Gibbon's loss was 122 killed, 592 wounded, total 714. Lee and Longstreet, from the main line of entrenchments, witnessed the gallant defence of Fort Gregg and its final fall. A.P. Hill, aroused by the terrific cannonade and musketry at daylight and riding to join his troops, had been killed by some stragglers of the 6th Corps, which, as has been told, had carried our lines and penetrated far inside of them. When Lee, on the night of April 1st, had heard of the disaster to Pickett at 5 Forks, he had wired for Longstreet with Field's division. This left only Kershaw's division and the local troops to hold Richmond, but Weitzel's force had already been so reduced that no aggressive idea was left him. Had he known of the withdrawal of Field's division, he might have been tempted to make an effort to take the city. On Longstreet's arrival in Petersburg, his troops were hurried to the entrenchments, whence they saw the gallant defence made by Fort Gregg, which had been done under the assurance that Longstreet is coming, hold for 2 hours, and all will be well. When these saw the forts captured, they expected nothing else but that the heavy blue columns and long lines would now move to crush them. But the lesson of Fort Gregg had not been thrown away. Grant recognized that Lee must retreat during the night, and that from his own position he would have the advantage in the start, and he preferred to order things prepared for the march westward in the morning. Lee had already advised Mr. Davis of the necessity of abandoning the lines that night, and having noted Grant's pause after the capture of Fort Gregg, now about 3 p.m., he issued the formal orders for the evacuation in time to have the troops begin to move at dark. My headquarters had been on the Richmond side for some months, and my duty included the command of Drury's and Chaffin's Bluffs and the defence of the river. It happened that on April 2nd I had prepared several torpedoes to be placed in the river that night, and early in the morning I went down into the swamp and was detained until late in the afternoon, when the orders of evacuation reached me. Part of my command was to cross the river at Drury's Bluff and part at Richmond. After giving necessary instructions, I rode into Richmond and took my post at the bridge to see my batteries go by. Many accounts have been given of the scenes in Richmond that night, and I will not refer to them. The freight depot of the Danville Road was close by the bridge, and I walked into it and saw large quantities of provisions and goods which had evidently run the blockade at Wilmington. I treated my horse to an English bridle and a felt saddle blanket, and I hung to a ring on my saddle a magnificent side of English bacon, which proved a great acquisition during the next few days. These provisions were intended for Lee's army and had been sent to Amelia C. H. from Danville, the train being ordered to come on to Richmond to take off the personnel and property of the government. Unfortunately, the officer in charge of it misunderstood his orders and came on without unloading at Amelia. Near my station in the street, a cellar door opened in the sidewalk, and while I waited for my batteries, a solitary Irish woman brought many bales of blankets from the freight depot in a wheelbarrow and tumbled them into the cellar. Many fires were burning in the city, and a canal boat in flames came floating under the bridge at which I stood. I could not see by what agency, but it was soon dragged away. The explosions of our little fleet of gunboats under Admiral Semes at Drury's Bluff were plainly heard, and the terrific explosion of the arsenal in Richmond. About sunrise, my last battalion passed, and I followed, taking a farewell look at the city from the Manchester side. The whole riverfront appeared to be in flames. Its formal surrender was made to Weitzel at 8:15 a.m. We marched 24 miles that day and bivouacked at night in some tall pine woods near Tomahawk Church. I had barely gotten supper when I was ordered to join 2 engineers being sent to find a wagon route for our guns and trains to an overhead railroad bridge across the Appomattox River. We travelled all night in mud and darkness, waking up residents to ask directions, but we finally got the whole column safely across the railroad bridge and went into camp near sundown about 3 miles from Amelia C.H. The next morning we passed through the village, where we should have gotten rations, but they did not meet us. They had gone on to Richmond and been destroyed there, as has been told. Here a few of the best-equipped battalions of artillery were selected to accompany the troops, while all the excess was turned over to Walker, chief of the 3rd Corps Artillery, to take on a direct road to Lynchburg. About 1 p.m., with Lee and Longstreet at the head of the column, we took the road for Jetersville, where it was reported that Sheridan was across our path, and Lee intended to attack him. We were not long in coming to where our skirmish line was already engaged, and a long conference took place between the generals and W.H.F. Lee in command of the cavalry. It appeared that the 2nd and 6th Corps were in front of us, but might be passed in the night by a flank march. We countermarched a short distance, and then turning to the right, we marched all night, passing Amelia Springs, and arrived at daylight at Rice's Turnout, 6 miles west of Burkesville. Here I was ordered to select a line of battle and take position to resist attack, and here we waited for the remainder of the army to come up and pass us, but we waited in vain. While the 2nd Corps had closely pressed the rear of the column all day, the cavalry and the 6th Corps had struck its flank under Ewell at Sailor's Creek. Besides Kershaw's division, this force comprised no veteran soldiers, but the employees of the departments under Custis Lee, the Marines and sailors of our little fleet under Admiral Tucker, and the heavy artillerists of Drury's and Chaffin's Bluffs, under Collor Crutchfield and Magiel Stiles. This force, though largely composed of men who had never before been under fire, surprised the enemy with an unexpected display of courage, such as had already been shown at Fort Stedman and Fort Gregg, and would still with ashes illuminate our last days. It formed a line of battle on the edge of a pine wood, in full view of 2 lines of battle in open ground across a little stream. It had no artillery to make reply, and it lay still while other Federal infantry was marched around them and submitted to an accurate and deliberate cannonade for 20 minutes, followed quickly by a charge of the 2 lines. Not a gun was fired until the enemy approached within 100 yards, showing handkerchiefs as an invitation to the men to surrender. Then 2 volleys broke both of their lines, and the excited Confederates charged in pursuit of the fleeing enemy, but were soon driven back by the fire of the guns. A second charge of the Federals soon followed, in which the 2 lines mingled in one promiscuous and prolonged melee with clubbed muskets and bayonets, as if bent upon exterminating each other individually. General Custis Lee, in his official report, thus describes the ending. Finding that my command was entirely surrounded to prevent useless sacrifice of life, the firing was stopped by some of my officers, aided by some of the enemy's, and the officers and men were taken as prisoners of war. Toward noon, the enemy began to appear in our front at Rice's Turnout and made demonstrations, but were easily held off by the artillery. Meanwhile, Lee had become very anxious over the non-arrival of Anderson's command, the remnants of Pickett's and Johnson's divisions, and at last rode to the rear to investigate. He did not return until near sundown, and with him came fuller news of the battle at Sailor's Creek, in which Anderson was also involved. Our loss had been about 8,000 men, with 6 generals, Ewell, Kershaw, Custis Lee, Dubose, Hunton, and Corse, all captured. One notable affair had taken place on this date, between a small force under Jenon Red, sent ahead by Ord to burn the high bridge on the Lynchburg road, and Deering's and Rosser's cavalry. The expedition consisted of 2 regiments of infantry and about 80 cavalry. They had gotten within a mile of the bridge, when our cavalry, in much larger force, attacked them. Humphreys writes, "A most gallant fight ensued in which Jenner's Red, Collier Washburn, and 3 other cavalry officers were killed. After heavy loss, the rest of the force surrendered. Jenner Deering, Colin Boston, and Majan Thompson of Ross's command were among the killed. About sundown, the enemy at Rice's showed a disposition to advance, and Lee soon gave orders to resume our retreat. In the morning we might have gone on toward Danville, but now we turned to the right and took the road to Lynchburg. I remember the night as one peculiarly uncomfortable. The road was crowded with disorganized men and deep in mud. We were moving all night and scarcely made 6 miles. About sunrise we got to Farmville and crossed the river on a bridge to the north side of the Appomattox, and here we received a small supply of rations. Here we found Jenner Lee. While we were getting breakfast, he sent for me and, taking out his map, showed me that the enemy had taken a highway bridge across the Appomattox near the High Bridge, were crossing on it, and would come in upon our road about 3 miles ahead. He directed me to send artillery there to cover our passage, and meanwhile to take personal charge of the 2 bridges at Farmville, the railroad and the highway, prepare them for burning, see that they were not fired too soon so as to cut off our own men, nor so late that the enemy might save them. While he explained, my eyes ran over the map, and I saw another road to Lynchburg than the one we were taking. This other kept the south side of the river, and was the straighter of the 2, our road joining it near Appomattox CH. I pointed this out, and he asked if I could find someone whom he might question. I had seen at a house nearby an intelligent man whom I brought up, and who confirmed the map. The Federals would have the shortest road to Appomattox Station, a common point a little beyond Appomattox CH. Saying there would be time enough to look after that, the general folded up his map, and I went to look after the bridges. As the enemy were already in sight, I set fire to the railroad bridge at once, and, having well prepared the highway bridge, I left my aide, Lit Mason, to fire it on a signal from me. It was also successfully burned. In The End of an Era, by John S. Wise, he has described an interview occurring between his father, Jenner Wise, and Jenner Lee at Farmville at this time, which I quote. We found Jenner Lee on the rear portico of the house I have mentioned. He had washed his face in a tin basin and stood drying his beard with a coarse towel as we approached. "Jenner Lee," exclaimed my father, "my poor brave men are lying on yonder hill more dead than alive. For more than a week they have been fighting day and night without food, and by God, sir, they shall not move another step until somebody gives them something to eat." "Come in, General," said Jenner Lee soothingly. "They deserve something to eat and shall have it, and meanwhile you shall share my breakfast." He disarmed everything like defiance by his kindness. Jenner Lee inquired what he thought of the situation. "Situation?" said the bold old man. "There is no situation. Nothing remains, Jen. Lee, but to put your poor men on your poor mules and send them home in time for the spring ploughing. This army is hopelessly whipped and is fast becoming demoralized. These men have already endured more than I believed flesh and blood could stand, and I say to you, sir, emphatically, that to prolong the struggle is murder, and the blood of every man who is killed from this time forth is on your head, Jenner Lee." This last expression seemed to cause Jenner Lee great pain. With a gesture of remonstrance, and even of impatience, he protested, "Oh, General, do not talk so wildly. My burdens are heavy enough. What would the country think of me if I did what you suggest?" "Country BDD," was the quick reply. "There is no country. There has been no country, General, for a year or more. You are the country to those men. They have fought for you. They have shivered through a long winter for you. Without pay or clothes or care of any sort, their devotion to you and faith in you have been the only things that have held this army together. If you demand the sacrifice, there are still left thousands of us who will die for you. You know the game is desperate beyond redemption, and that if you so announce, no man or government or people will gainsay your decision. That is why I repeat that the blood of any man killed hereafter is on your head." Jenner Lee stood for some time at an open window looking out at the throng now surging by upon the roads and in the fields, and made no response. Well might Lee say, "My burdens are heavy enough. General Wise had in no way exaggerated them. Pogue's battalion of artillery had gone ahead to the intersecting road Lee had mentioned, and Mahone's division, now assigned to our corps, supported by Pogue's guns, took a good position and began to fortify. They held the position all day, being charged in the afternoon, repulsing the enemy and charging in turn. They captured the colours of the 5th NH and regained one of our guns, which had been overrun by numbers. The enemy, Miles's division, reported a loss for the day of 571. The march of our column was continued under the protection of Mahone's division, with but one slight interruption. Crook's division of cavalry forded the river on our left and moved toward our train. Gregg's brigade, in the lead, was charged by Mumford and Rosser, and Gregg and a bunch of prisoners were captured, on which the rest of the division was withdrawn. Our march was now kept up all night and the next day until sundown. I rode off from the road after midnight with my staff and found a fence corner where we could rest a while without having our horses stolen as we slept, for I had now had but one night's rest out of 6. After sundown on the 7th, Mahone, still holding the road against the 2nd Corps under Humphreys, asked a flag of truce to enable him to remove the wounded left in front of his line when he charged and captured the colours of the 5th NH. When the reply came, granting the truce for an hour, it brought also a letter from Grant to Lee as follows. April 7th, 1865. General, the result of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. U.S. Grant, Latin Gene. Lee, at that moment, happened to be near Mahone's lines, and within an hour the following reply was delivered to Gene Seth Williams, the bearer. April 7th, 1865. General, I have received your note of this date. Though not entertaining the opinion you express on the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia, I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer on condition of its surrender. R. E. Lee, Genin. The next day, the 8th, was the first quiet day of our retreat. The 2nd Corps followed us up closely, but there was no collision. All the rest of the Federal Army had taken the more direct road which I had seen on Lee's map, and was marching to get ahead of us at Appomattox C.H. During the day I rode for a while with General Pendleton, our Chief of Artillery. He told me that some of the leading generals had conferred, and decided that it would be well to represent to Lee that, in their opinion, the cause was now hopeless, in order that he might surrender and allow the odium of making the first proposition to be placed upon them. But it was thought that Longstreet was the man to make the proposition to Lee. Longstreet had not been consulted, and Pendleton had undertaken to broach the matter to him, and had done so. Longstreet had indignantly rejected the proposition, saying that his duty was to help hold up Lee's hands, not to beat them down, that his corps could still whip twice its number, and as long as that was the case, he would never be the one to suggest a surrender. On this, Pendleton himself had made bold to make the suggestion to Lee. From his report of the conversation, he had met a decided snub, and was plainly embarrassed in telling of it. Lee had answered very coldly, "There are too many men here to talk of laying down their arms without fighting." Evidently, Lee preferred to himself take the whole responsibility of surrender, as he had always taken that of his battles, whatever their issue, entirely alone. Some time in the afternoon he received Grant's reply to his inquiry as to the terms proposed. It was as follows. Farmville, April 8th, 1865. General, your note of last evening in reply to mine of same date, asking the condition on which I will accept the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia is received. In reply, I would say that peace being my great desire, there is but one condition I would insist upon, namely, that the men and officers surrendered shall be disqualified from taking up arms again against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. I will meet you, or will designate officers to meet any officers you may name for the same purpose at any point agreeable to you, for the purpose of arranging definitely the terms upon which the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia will be received. U.S. Grant, Letter Gen. Lee received this late in the afternoon of the 8th. It was answered from the roadside and delivered to Humphreys after sundown for transmission to Grant. Lee had but recently been appointed Commander-in-Chief of all the Confederate armies, and he now delays the surrender of his own army in order that the negotiation may include that of all the Confederate forces under his command. In accomplishing this, he might reasonably hope to secure the best possible terms, as it would bring instant peace everywhere. His letter was as follows. April 8, 1865. General, I received at a late hour your note of today. In mine of yesterday I did not intend to propose the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, but to ask the terms of your proposition. To be frank, I do not think the emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of this army. But as the restoration of peace should be the object of all, I desire to know whether your proposals would lead to that end. I cannot therefore meet you with a view to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia, but as far as your proposal may affect the Confederate States forces under my command, and tend to the restoration of peace, I should be pleased to meet you at 10 a.m. tomorrow on the old stage road to Richmond between the picket lines of the two armies. R. E. Lee, Jenner. This letter was received by Grant at Curdsville, a roadside village on the road Lee had travelled, about midnight. It was not answered until in the morning, as Grant did not intend to accept Lee's invitation to meet him at 10 a.m. Grant had doubtless had an early interview in his mind when he sent his second letter, and was probably accompanying the Sudi Corps that he might be conveniently near. But he had been recently cautioned from Washington about making or discussing any political terms, and as Lee's letter seemed to involve a chance of such discussions, he apparently decided to make the proposed meeting impossible by at once leaving that road and riding across to the road being travelled by Ord and Sheridan. Before starting, however, he replied to Lee from Curdsville as follows. April 9th, 1865. General, your note of yesterday is received. I have no authority to treat on the subject of peace. The meeting proposed for 10 a.m. today could lead to no good. I will state, however, General, that I am equally anxious for peace with yourself, and the whole North entertains the same feeling. The terms upon which peace can be had are well understood. By the South laying down their arms, they will hasten that most desirable event, save thousands of human lives and hundreds of millions of property not yet destroyed. Seriously hoping that all our difficulties may be settled without the loss of another life, I subscribe myself, etc. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant Jenny. Meanwhile, during the afternoon, we had approached Appomattox C.H., 2 miles beyond which was the junction of our road with the one on which Sheridan and Ord were now approaching, and already the advanced guards of the two forces were in collision. Lee arranged during the evening with Gordon and Fitz-Lee, who had the advance, that they should make a vigorous attack at dawn and endeavour to clear the road. This was done, and, in evidence of it, a battery of 12 PR. Napoleon's was presently sent in to me, having been captured by a cavalry charge of Robert's brigade. Though this evidenced good spirit on the part of our men, our advance made no progress, and the increased. Reports told of large forces already in our front. Lee was up at an early hour and sent Colin Venable to Gordon to inquire how he progressed. Gordon's answer was, "Tell General Lee I have fought my corps to a frazzle, and I fear I can do nothing unless I am heavily supported by Longstreet's corps." When Lee received this message, he exclaimed, "Then there is nothing left me but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Venable writes, "Convulsed with passionate grief, many were the wild words which we spoke as we stood around him. Said one, 'O General, what will history say of the surrender of the army in the field?' He replied, 'Yes, I know they will say hard things of us, They will not understand how we were overwhelmed by numbers. But that is not the question, Colonel. The question is it right to surrender this army? If it is right, then I will take all the responsibility." Meanwhile, the march of the army had come to a halt in front, while, for a time, the rear closed slowly up. I had bivouacked near the road, and soon after sunrise I came upon Lee with his staff by the roadside at the top of a hill. The general called me to him, and taking his seat upon a felled oak, peeled off its bark, and referring to the map we had looked at together on the 7th, he said, "Well, we have come to the junction, and they seem to be here ahead of us. What have we got to do today?" I had been somewhat prepared by my talk with Pendleton, had formulated a plan of my own, and was glad to have a chance to present it. My command, having been north of the James, had had no share in the fighting about Petersburg, and but little in the retreat. They had now begun to hear of a surrender, and would hint their sentiments in loud voices when I rode by. "We don't want to surrender any ammunition. We've been saving ammunition all this war. Hope we were not saving it for a surrender." I told the general of this, and said that if he saw fit to try and cut our way out, my command would do as well as they had ever done. He answered, "I have left only 2 divisions, Field's and Mahone's, sufficiently organised to be relied upon. All the rest have been broken and routed, and can do little good. Those divisions are now scarcely 4,000 apiece, and that is far too little to meet the force now in front of us." This was just the opportunity wished, and I hastened to lay my plan before him. I said, "Then we have only choice of 2 courses, either to surrender or to take to the woods and bushes, with orders either to rally on Johnston or perhaps better on the governors of the respective states. If we surrender this army, it is the end of the Confederacy. I think our best course would be to order each man to go to the governor of his own state with his arms." "What would you hope to accomplish by that?" said he. "In the first place," said I, "to stand the chances. If we surrender this army, every other army will have to follow suit. All will go like a row of bricks, and if the rumours of help from France have any foundation, the news of our surrender will put an end to them. But the one thing which may be possible in our present situation is to get some sort of terms. None of our armies are likely to be able to get them, and that is why we should try with the different states. Already it has been said that Vance can make terms for NC, and Joe Brown for GA. Let the governor of each state make some sort of a show of force, and then surrender on terms which may save us from trials for treason and confiscations." As I talked, it all looked to me so reasonable that I hoped he was convinced, for he listened in silence. So I went on more confidently. "But, General, apart from all that, if all fails and there is no hope, the men who have fought under you for 4 years have got the right this morning to ask one favour of you. We know that you do not care for military glory, but we are proud of the record of this army. We want to leave it untarnished to our children. It is a clear record so far, and now is about to be closed. A little blood more or less now makes no difference, and we have the right to ask of you to spare us the mortification of having you ask Grant for terms, and have him answer that he has no terms to offer. That it is U.S. unconditional surrender." That was his reply to Buckner at Fort Donelson and to Pemberton at Vicksburg, and that is what is threatened us. General, spare us the mortification of asking terms and getting that reply." He heard it all so quietly, and it was all so true, it seemed to me, and so undeniable, that I felt sure that I had him convinced. His first words were, "If I should take your advice, how many men do you suppose would get away?" "2/3 of us," I answered. "We would be like rabbits and partridges in the bushes, and they could not scatter to follow us." He said, "I have not over 15,000 muskets left. 2/3 of them divided among the states, even if all could be collected, would be too small a force to accomplish anything. All could not be collected. Their homes have been overrun, and many would go to look after their families. Then, General, you and I, as Christian men, have no right to consider only how this would affect us. We must consider its effect on the country as a whole. Already it is demoralized by the 4 years of war. If I took your advice, the men would be without rations and under no control of officers. They would be compelled to rob and steal in order to live. They would become mere bands of marauders, and the enemy's cavalry would pursue them and overrun many wide sections they may never have. Occasion to visit. We would bring on a state of affairs it would take the country years to recover from. And as for myself, you young fellows might go to bushwhacking, but the only dignified course for me would be to go to General Grant and surrender myself and take the consequences of my acts. He paused for only a moment and then went on. But I can tell you one thing for your comfort. Grant will not demand an unconditional surrender. He will give us as good terms as this army has the right to demand, and I am going to meet him in the rear at 10 a.m. and surrender the army on the condition of not fighting again until exchanged. I had not a single word to say in reply. He had answered my suggestion from a place so far above it that I was ashamed of having made it. With friends, I planned to make an escape on seeing a flag of truce, but that idea was at once abandoned by all of them on hearing my report. At this time, the negotiations had been definitely broken off by Lee's second letter. The meeting which this proposed had been declined by Grant in a letter now on its way to Lee, but not yet received. He had told me Grant's terms as if he knew them, but later he felt some uneasiness lest Grant might not feel bound by his offer after it had once been declined. Longstreet in Manassas to Appomattox mentions his apprehensions on this subject, but states that he, from personal acquaintance with Grant, felt able to assure Lee that there would be no humiliating demands, and the event justified that assurance. About 8:30 o'clock, Lee, in a full suit of new uniform, with sword and sash and an embroidered belt, boots and gold spurs, rode to the rear, hoping soon to meet Grant and to be able to make the surrender. Instead, he learned of Grant's change of route and was handed Grant's letter, dated that morning, and declining the interview. He at once wrote a reply as follows, and asked to have it sent to overtake Grant on his long ride. April 9th, 1865. General, I received your note of this morning on the picket line, whither I had come to meet you, and ascertained definitely what terms were embraced in your proposal of yesterday, with reference to the surrender of this army. I now ask an interview in accordance with the offer contained in your letter of yesterday for that purpose. R. E. Lee, General. While this last message was being prepared, a messenger riding like the wind dashed around a curve, and seeing Lee, and having but one arm, with difficulty stopped his horse nearly 100 yards beyond. All recognized the rider, Colonel John Haskell of Longstreet's artillery, and, as his horse was checked, Lee went to meet him, exclaiming, "What is it? What is it?" And then, without waiting for a reply, "Oh, why did you do it? You have killed your beautiful horse!" Haskell explained that Fitz Lee had sent in a report that he had found a road by which the army could escape, and that Longstreet had ordered him to overtake Lee before he could send a note to Grant and to kill his horse to do it. Longstreet, in his book, says that Haskell's arrival was too late, that the note had gone. But Humphreys's narrative shows that Colon Whittier, who took the note, witnessed Haskell's arrival before the note was finished. Lee, however, had not credited the report, and a later messenger soon came to say that the report was a mistake. When Field's division had been halted by the flag of truce, Humphreys' corps was within a half-mile, and under his orders it soon appeared to be making preparation for a further advance. Field, meanwhile, went to entrenching. Grant had instructed Humphreys not to let the correspondence delay his movements. In Longstreet's front, Gordon had all the morning been engaged with Sheridan, and firing both of musketry and artillery was still in progress. Lee had at first neglected to give authority to ask for a truce, but later sent it to Gordon, who sent Meiji. Sims of Longstreet's staff to request one. Sims met Custer, who had himself conducted to Gordon, and demanded the immediate and unconditional surrender of the army, which Gordon refused. Custer said, Sheridan directs me to say to you, General, if there is any hesitation about your surrender, that he has you surrounded and can annihilate your command in an hour." Gordon replied, "There is a flag between Lee and Grant for the purpose of surrender, and if General Sheridan decides to continue the fighting in the face of the flag of truce, the responsibility for the bloodshed will be his and not mine." On this, Gordon says, Custer rode off with Madge, Hunter of Gordon's staff, asking to be guided to Longstreet's position. Finding Longstreet, he made the same demand for immediate and unconditional surrender. I have told of this scene elsewhere more at length, but did not know until the recent publication of Gordon's book that it was Custer's second attempt that morning to secure the surrender of the army to himself. Longstreet rebuffed him, however, very roughly, far more so than appears in Longstreet's account of the interview. Meanwhile, in our rear, more serious trouble threatened. The Second Corps, closely followed by the Sixth, began to advance. Lee, who was still awaiting between the lines Grant's reply to his letter, which had over 15 miles to go and did not reach Grant until 11:50 a.m., sent by his staff officers 2 earnest verbal requests to Humphreys not to press upon him, as negotiations were going on for a surrender. Humphreys, under his orders, felt unable to comply, although the second request was very urgent. He sent word to Lee, who was in full sight on the road, within 100 yards of the head of the Second Corps, that he must withdraw at once.